Hi, and welcome to this week's Roundtable with Joey's Legacy. I'm Carrie Hyde, your host, and with me tonight we have Dr. Jean Dodds, Jerry Robb, and attorney Anna. We just talked about this, didn't we? I knew it would mess me up. Say your last name for me.
Morrison-Ricordotti.
Ricordotti. She just gave me this cute little way to do it, and I said, "Oh, now I'll never forget." So, Dr. Jean Dodds, if you don't know, is a world-renowned veterinarian who speaks a lot about the pet industry. And if you're local, if you're one of my listeners and you're local here in Orange County, you should know that she is one of the veterinarians that I refer all of my clients to because she is just so fabulous. Dr. Dodds, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here. It's so great to have you here and be a part of this group with me. So it's awesome. We also have with us Jerry Robb, who is the author of Joey's Legacy, the collection of horrible stories of pets who have lost their lives through veterinary malpractice. Jerry, did we lose you?
Oh no.
Well, we lost Jerry. I'm sure he'll be back in. So, and of course, with us, we have one of the fabulous attorneys that is part of Joey's Legacy, and we couldn't do this without our veterinarians and our attorney. Anna, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And just taking your time out and coming out here, both of you. This organization wouldn't be able to continue going without you. So it's just amazing. And I wanted to start this off before some of our questions of the followers and listeners come on with asking you a question, Dr. Dodds. I always ask this, and I always ask if our veterinarians that are on here, and I probably asked you again, but for our new listeners, have you ever witnessed veterinary malpractice? So I ask that all the time because some of our listeners are listening and they haven't been a victim of it. And I think one of our struggles with getting this organization we want to get this documentary made, which is what we talk about a lot, is how much we need this documentary. And I think a lot of the people who follow or listen may think that veterinary malpractice is rare. And while I think it's rare that animals are dying through veterinary malpractice, and maybe you would disagree or agree with me, I think veterinary malpractice happens daily. It just doesn't always result in death, and sometimes people don't even know what happens to them. Would you agree with that statement?
I agree. Yes, many people are unaware of what's going on, and part of the problem with working outside the acceptable broad ranges of practice is that they don't necessarily read what's going on today, especially that have graduated 20 or more years ago, may not be keeping up on what's going on and what's going on. And recently to be asked to write a molecular update on what's going on with bleeding diseases that are heritable pets, which I've spent my life studying. And the two rejected my paper, one from Greece and one from Poland, because they'd never heard of me. The problem, I didn't know what I was doing. And why was I reviewing what's already been published? Well, it was a review. That was the whole point.
Wow.
Physical expression of disease to understanding genetics, go into the of the disease, and then try to do gene therapy or other things to correct it. That's what it was about. And I felt so embarrassed that they did, because I'm much older than they are, and the journal told me who they were, which they I was able to realize that before they.
Wow.
So they don't have a background, and the whole point of the review was to look at how have taken us from to molecular nanotechnology, which is so amazing, right?
Yeah.
So they said, well, are you going to rebut it and resubmit it? I said, no, I don't need another paper. I wasn't going to, there's no point in do their homework. The journalists have to be more careful when they select reviewers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think we live in I hate to say this, a lot of our younger generation really is looking at, well, how much do I know you? If I don't know you, that doesn't make your information not valuable.
Correct.
Our experience alone should make it valuable. But I hear that too. Well, what have you done? Who are you?
Yeah.
Because we're so
All you have to do is ask the question. I'm not familiar with the back. Please explain, you know,
yeah.
what you've done and why it's important for us today.
Well, when
Right?
they finally figure out who Dr. Jean Dodds is, I hope they're going to be embarrassed.
Oh, I don't know. You very over the years received a couple of people that have written to me and said they were embarrassed and they were very sorry. And one person, an internal medicine specialist here when I first moved to California, exactly that. And I said, well, I'm certainly not going to try to explain who I am. Why don't you ask your mentor? So she asked Dr. X, and I got an email from this young person saying, I am so sorry,
Wow.
which was so I still refer patients to her because the guts to say she didn't know, you know?
Those are the best doctors, whether you're
Yes.
Yes,
human or veterinarian, the doctor
right.
who can say, or we could take it out of the medical field and even
Yeah,
attorney to say,
sure.
I don't know. If you can find that person, that to me is just incredible because that's the person who's learning from their mistakes,
100%.
right?
100%.
So
Yeah.
it's
So the
important.
problems are human frailty, not nothing else, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we always start this off a little bit with a little explanation about it's important that our listeners know that veterinary malpractice does happen and that it's happening more frequently than they know. And it's probably happened to most people's animals. I've witnessed it many, many times. But people often think of the word veterinary malpractice or malpractice as it needing to be something very extreme, like death. So can you define before we get into some of these questions so that'll help maybe guide the questions a little bit about what malpractice is and maybe the difference between malpractice and negligence?
That's for Anna.
Yes, Anna.
Sure, no problem. And veterinary malpractice. I know malpractice sounds kind of more sinister, but really, it's basically veterinary negligence. It's just a different standard because, like, you or I can be negligent for something. Like, let's say I drop a bottle on the floor and I didn't clean it up, or I didn't do what a reasonable person would have done and clean it up, and then someone slips on it. It's my fault. I'm negligent for doing that. I didn't mean for someone to get hurt from that, but I didn't take the proper steps that I, as a regular person, should have taken to make that right, to fix the mistake I made. But with veterinarians, because they have a different level of knowledge, they have a higher level of knowledge, so they're held to a higher standard, and so they have standards of conduct, or basically, what you look at in a malpractice case is whether or not the veterinarian's conduct fell below the reasonable standards of care. So if they didn't meet those standards of care, then they're going to be responsible. They're going to have committed an act of malpractice. Now, in the law, whether you can be compensated for that, or whether you can actually um, do something in the civil courts, depends on your damages. So it has to be that there was a breach of the standard of care, and but for that breach, your animal wouldn't have been harmed. Because there's disciplinary committees that will look at standards of care and breaches, but they look at it just for the discipline, to say, like, well, they didn't do this right, so maybe we should talk to them, or find out something we can do to make them better. But when it's a person like you or I, that their animal may have been harmed by a veterinarian, then there has to be both the breach and the damages. And when you look at cases, involving veterinary malpractice, you need to have another veterinarian, of a similar kind of background, or, in that same area, because there are subspecialties and there's all sorts of different, standards, like for specialists, people who maybe hold themselves out as, maybe they're a dental specialist, or maybe they're some kind of like a cancer specialist. They're held to an even higher standard of care, or a different standard of care that that makes them, like, if they commit a mistake, or if they make a mistake with the knowledge, they look at what a veterinarian with that same knowledge would have done, and whether there's a breach. But you really do have to have that and the damages for a civil case. So that's kind of where we're at. But
Yeah.
what's interesting, and I know Dr. Dodds may have a kind of comment on this, but what I've seen in some of the cases we've had more recently is that general practitioner veterinarians have been trying to do things that specialists or only specialists should be doing. And that causes a problem because you're still, they're still going to be held to what the specialists, at least in a lot of situations, would be held to, even though they don't have that, they don't have that knowledge. And, they shouldn't have maybe attempted something that required a specialist. But with all of this, I should say that these things vary state by state. So when you're looking at the legal analysis of it, you've got to talk to an attorney in your state, in your jurisdiction, your county, because the laws differ in how these are specifically applied. There's like general principles, and then there's a very specific application, and that's what can vary.
Yeah.
That in the several cases I've got, that we've had a very serious issue because, first of all, the people have suffered, and they've had a huge bill as well, and they're grieving, and they're gonna pay help because that anger actually diffuses reality. And so, like you just said, it can be different states have different standards, and they say, well, that's only hearsay legally. You can't. Person told me, when you don't have any writing or proof that they said what they said. So the problem is it isn't that there wasn't necessarily negligence, it's that the caregiver doesn't understand the legal huge broad within the practice. Even though you and I might not do that, it's still within the defined standard within that region, for example. So I have this all the time, and I tell people, but that's hearsay. That's legal.
Well, yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Go.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, hearsay is, I'll explain that. It's a little tricky, that term, because hearsay really just means like an out of court statement taken for truth. Like they told me this or they told me that, but
Yes.
really more what it is it's there's a certain amount of discretion that's allowed in like a professional. So if you reach a fork in the road, like say that there's like your animal comes in, they're sick, maybe they have diarrhea, they have they're vomiting, and you say, well, they could either have this, they might have a stomach problem, or they might have something else, an underlying blood disorder. You do all the tests, and it's still equally possible they could have one thing wrong or something else. If the veterinarian just picks A versus B as the course of action, and that turns out to be wrong, it doesn't mean they committed an act of malpractice simply because they made the wrong choice. It just means that they made the wrong choice. It's actionable if most of the veterinarians, if the veterinarians, if they're like, whoa, there's no way I would have picked choice A. I would have, absolutely would have picked choice B. There were tons of things they should have looked at. They should have gone with B. That's when you go into malpractice. But the key, it's important to realize there too, is that it's not that they intended to do it wrong. It's that they made a mistake. That's what malpractice is. And it comes to be a big issue with juries also, because sometimes juries don't like to hold professionals, and I don't know why, but they don't like to hold them responsible unless it was an intentional act. And that that rarely happens. It really only happens usually when somebody's trying to cover up something they did or they did wrong. But with malpractice, it's what the veterinarian typically looks at when we have to, we submit records to a veterinarian to review. They look at the actual documents from the doctors, the words themselves, the words like their records, what the veterinary doctors put down in the writing. That's what they look at. They will sometimes look at what was told to a person. So that could be hearsay, meaning that they, in a sense of like, they told me this, which is really kind of an admission against interest if it's taken as truth. But the veterinarians can look at the timeline that a client or a companion animal's guardian submits, but they look at that kind of secondarily more for things like failure to inform. But I will tell you, there have been instances where we found veterinary records that have been changed and altered, or they are not inputted the same day. That's why when we tell people the best practice is every time you go to a veterinarian, get those records that day and get them, get everything you need that day, because if something happens later, you don't necessarily have access to their computer system. You don't know how much access they have, when they can make those changes. And every time we've gotten into a legal fight over it, the attorneys representing the veterinarians in their veterinary offices, do not want to tell us the software providers. They don't want to tell us how those records are kept. And so it becomes a fight. And that's where